Good morning. Our learning should be Ilin Nishmas, the 8 Kedoshim who died protecting the land of Israel and the Jewish people. And Shabbos should have an Aliyah. It's Hashem. Okay, so we are going to learn today a topic called Bishol Achar Afia, which means cooking after baking. So let's do a little quick review about some of the, we're going to be on page 77, but before we jump in, let's just do a quick review about the different stages of cooking. So there's something called the Kli Rishon. Kli Rishon is the primary utensil that something is cooked in, right? First time we did this, a lot, right? By the third time, by we keep on reviewing it, eventually this principle is just going to be like natural. We're going to be like, of course, I know, fine. So Kli Rishon is the utensil which is the cooking took place in. So whether that is your urn, right? Your urn is a Kli Rishon because that's where the cooking takes place. Or it's a pot that's sitting on the fire, that's also a Kli Rishon, right? Anything within the cooking took place in, that is called a Kli Rishon. Nothing goes in a Kli Rishon, okay? Just to be safe, more or less, nothing's going to go into Kli Rishon, okay? We're just going to speak in broad generalities. There might be some exceptional cases, but you're typically not going to put something into a Kli Rishon. We'll see some exceptions, but for the most part, we will have some exceptions, like you're burning cholent. We'll talk about that. But for the most part, you're not going to put things typically into a Kli Rishon. The exception may be hot items that are cooked. We'll get there, okay? But for the most part, don't put anything in your Kli Rishon, okay? That's number one. Then you have stage number 2, which is called a Kli Sheni, a secondary utensil. So what's a secondary utensil? Meaning I take something out of my urn and I put it into a cup. That cup is a Kli Sheni. I take my pot and I go ahead and I pour it into another pot. That second thing is a Kli Sheni. Into the Kli Sheni, technically from a biblical perspective, there is no cooking taking place. Rabbinically, we typically want to avoid putting things into that, because it looks like cooking, it's still hot. What you could put in there are things which are pre-cooked. So if something is cooked already, right? Something was already cooked, you could go ahead and put it into you're allowed to put it into the Kli Sheni, which is already not considered cooking biblically. You're allowed to put something which is cooked already into a Kli Sheni. Okay? That's so far. And then we talked about a Kli Shlishi. So I go, let's say Kli Shlishi again, as I take water from my urn. So the urn is Kli Rishon. Put it into my cup, that's a Kli Sheni, and then I pour it into another cup, that's a Kli Shlishi, that's a third utensil. There, the way we landed, although this is a matter of some debate, is most poskim say you can put anything into a Kli Shlishi, okay? There is some discussion about something called a Kale HaBishol, things which cook very, very quickly. So everyone agrees, like an egg cannot be put into a Kli Shlishi, because it cooks too quickly. Okay, an egg would be a prime example. Where there's some debate is what about other things which might be called kali bishul. So there are those who say you cannot put tea into a kali into a kli shlishi because tea is kali bishul, and therefore there are those who don't make tea on Shabbos at all. Many others, relying on Moshe Feinstein, say no. Once it's in a third utensil, by definition, it does not cook, and therefore you could put things. You can't put an egg, but you could put tea into a kli shlishi because no bishul, no cooking takes place, and it does not appear like cooking at that point, and therefore kli shlishi is okay. Everyone's going to agree about an egg, but you could put a lemon, you could put tea, according to many opinions, in a kli shlishi. Yes.
Whole egg or
no, a whole egg, because it's going to cook the egg.
Cook so easily?
Yeah. Cooks easily. An egg, right? It doesn't have to get so cooked for it to be edible. Yeah, and eggs are not put into a Kli Shlishi. Okay, I've never tried, but no. But right, Karen's asking, do I have to crack it into the thing? But I think just simply putting it in, I believe the poskim are talking about an egg across the board, that it would be considered cooked. But yeah, all right. I would avoid it. I would avoid putting an egg in. Okay, fine, good. Kli Rishon, nothing, more or less nothing. Kli Sheni, pre-cooked items can be recooked into a Kli Sheni, but other things should be avoided. Kli Shlishi. Not an egg, but according to most poskim, everything else. Almost everything else. Okay? Fine. Now, let's talk about cooking after baking, right? So we saw cooking after cooking, I could do in a Kli Sheni. What about after I bake something? So let's talk about a piece of bread. I baked some bread, right? And now I want to put that bread into something that would cook it. So for example, I want to put it into my chicken soup, right? I want to put my challah into my chicken soup. Happens every Shabbos in my home, right? What are you allowed, right? So there, it's been cooked. It hasn't been cooked yet. It was only been baked. Do we say once it's already gone through some processing of some sort, then I'm allowed to process it again? Whether it's cooking or baking, it doesn't matter. Or do we say no? If it's cooked, I'm allowed to recook it. If it's cooked, I'm not allowed to go ahead. If it's baked, I'm not allowed to go ahead and cook it after that, right? That's going to be some of the discussion. Is it the same process, or once it's gone through any process, it's going to be okay? We'll see. It's a matter of much debate. We'll begin on page 77 in Maseches Pesachim. The Mishnah over here, the Gemara over here is talking about the Korban Pesach. Okay, the Korban Pesach, when the Beis Hamikdash stood, or when they brought the Korban Pesach, I should say, they would. How would they prepare the Korban Pesach? What do you do to it? You roast it, right? It is forbidden to cook the Korban Pesach. You're not allowed, if you like roasted lamb, you like cooked lamb, too bad. You're only allowed to roast the lamb. That's how the Korban Pesach was made, and that's the halacha. Okay, so the brisa says like this. Look at source number 1 on page 77. L'chidetanya was taught in a brisa. Bishlu va'achar kach tzla'o. Let's say the person boiled the Korban Pesach and then roasted it afterwards. Oshit tzla'o va'achar kach bishlu. Or they roasted it and then they cooked it. Okay, so in both cases they are roasting and cooking. One case the cooking comes first, one case the cooking comes after. Chayav, you are liable to receive lashes. In other words, it's totally forbidden. It's a prohibition. It's going against a prohibition in the Torah if you go ahead and you cook your Korban Pesach. Even if you then go ahead and roast it, or even if you roast it first, then you say, I don't really like roasted Pesach, lamb. I'm going to cook it afterwards. Chayav, you get lashes.
What do you mean by cooking? They translate it as boiled, which involves water.
So correct. Correct. So let me explain more in detail. Meaning I then put it in a pot of water and I boil it. Okay, basically fine. Boil it. Thank you. Okay, so basically I go ahead and I roast it first, and then I go ahead and put it in a pot of water, or I put it in a pot of water and then I roast it. Either case, I'm going to be chayav. I'm going to get lashes because I went against a prohibition in the Torah. The Gemara says bishlama bishlu v'achkach tzlo chayav. I understand why if I cook it and then I roast it, I'm going to be liable. Da bishle. Because at the end of the day, it was cooked. I can't undo the cooking. If I first put it in a pot of water and then I roast it, it's cooked. And therefore, even though I roast it afterwards, of course I'm going to be chayiv. Elatzlo v'achar kach bishlo, in the scenario where I roasted it and then I cooked it, hatzli yeshu. At the end of the day, it's roasted. So if I roasted it and then I roasted it and then I put it in a pot of water, the Gemara asks, at the end of the day, this is called roasted lamb. Why am I going to be liable? So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Kahana, Hamani Rav Yossi. The author of this brisa is Rav Yossi. The Tanya Rav Yossi, we have a brisa that says like this. And here now we're going to move on to the laws of matzah. Okay, we're going to bring this back to Shabbos, I promise. Okay, but we're talking about now matzah. Okay, so how do you make matzah? Matzah has to be baked, right? To be called lechem, to be called bread, you have to bake the bread. Okay, over here you have to bake the matzah. Okay, so the brisa says yotzin birakik hasharoi. A person's allowed to fulfill their obligation if they take matzah and then soak it in water. You could fulfill your obligation. If you then eat it, you can fulfill your obligation. Big discussion practically if you're supposed to do that. Certainly if a person's not whatever, don't take this practically. But the first opinion says if you have matzah that was baked and then you soak it in water, that's fine. Umevushol shelo nimuach. And not only soaking it, but even if you put it in hot water, as long as it doesn't start to disintegrate, become like dissolved, then it's okay. Divrei Meir. That's the opinion of Rav Meir. Rav Yossi Omer. Rav Yossi says, Yotzin birakik hasharoi. You could fulfill your obligation with matzah that was soaked. Avalo b'mevushal. But not once it's cooked. Afal pi shelo nimuach. Even though it didn't get dissolved, the cooking is perceived to undo the roasting, the baking. So Rav Yossi in the laws of matzah tells us that if I have matzah, I bought matzah that was baked, and then I put it in I boil it in water. Even though I see it's matzah still, it looks like matzah, but I boiled it in water for a little bit. Then in doing so, it's no longer considered baked. Okay, it's like a new thing. Now it's considered cooked, and therefore it's no longer considered baked. That's the opinion of Rav Yossi, and that's how we want to explain the brisa that said that if I roasted it and then I went and cooked it and boiled it in water, then it's considered I'm in violation of this prohibition of cooking. Why? Because even though I roasted it, the cooking in water, the boiling in water undoes. It's seen as like a new act, and therefore I'm going to be liable. Okay? So far we've been talking about the laws of Korban Pesach, the laws of matzah. Okay? What does this have to do with our discussion? Let's turn the page. Okay? Says, let's just look at Rashi, how Rashi frames it, and then we'll see how it relates to our halachos. So Rashi, source number 2 says, Avalo b'mevushal, delav lechem karina be. Says Rav Yossi, if I cook it in water, if I boil it in water, it's no longer called bread. V'afal pi shekvar nefa betanor, even though it's already baked in an oven, hoil v'chazer ubishlo. Since I went back and I boiled it in water, bitlo mitores lechem. You undid the status of it being called bread. Okay? So now let's see how this applies to our halachos. So Eliezer of Metz, in the book called Sefer Yereim, a very important early book about halacha. This goes back to the medieval age. Source number 3, the Sefer Yereim writes like this: V'chol davar shenisbashel o ne'efa kol tzorko. If anything was cooked or baked entirely, Lachziro b'chli rishon lechamemo. Let's say a person wants to put it back into a primary utensil to warm it up. O litno b'tzada or to put it on the side of a fire, next to a fire. Mutter, it is allowed. Shekol davar shenisbashel, anything which was cooked, boiled in water. O nasa kol tzarko, or it was completely prepared. Ein bo mishom bishul. There's no issue of cooking it again, of boiling it again. Shem bishul achar bishul. There's no boiling after boiling. However, aval yesh bishul achar tzli, but there is a concept of cooking something in water after it was roasted. V'yesh tzli achar bishul, and there would be a prohibition of roasting something after it was cooked in water. In other words, there's no bishul achar bishul, cooking something in water and then cooking it in water again on Shabbos, that's not a problem. Or if you roasted something, you prepared it with a fire, and then you put it next to a fire again on Shabbos, also not a problem. But if you boil it in water after you roasted it, or you roast it after you boiled in water, that's going to be a problem. What's his proof? Titania, the brisa we just saw, Psach and Perikal Shabbos Sofa, we saw, Tzlao, the brisa said, if a person roasted something, Va'achar kach bishlo, they roasted the Karban Pesach, and then they cooked it in water, Chayav, you are going to be liable. Umatma Talmuda, and the Gemara asks, Amai, why is that? Hatzli Eshu, wasn't it roasted already? And Amar Rav Kahana explained, Hamani Rav Yossi, the opinion of this, it is Rav Yossi, and we're just quoting what we saw earlier. Tanya, who said in the Brisa, Yotzin Birkik Hashari Muvushal Shaloni Moach, right? The Brisa said that a person can fulfill their mitzvah of matzah with matzah that was soaked, and even if it's cooked, as long as it wasn't dissolved, Divrei Meir. And Rav Yossi Omer, Yotzim Birkik Hasharoi, a person could fulfill their mitzvah of matzah with matzah that was soaked, Avalo b'mevushal, but not if it was cooked in water, Afal Pishloni Moach, even if it was not dissolved. And now he explains Perush, Gabe matzah lechem ksiv, by matzah it says bread. Ve'eno nikra lechem ela afoi velo mevushal. To be called bread, it has to be baked and not cooked. Ukshebishlu achar achipiyaso, and when it is cooked after being baked, Nikr mevushal, it's now called being cooked, boiled. Diesh bishul achrafia, because there is a concept of cooking something or boiling something even after it was baked. Hu adin nami, so too tzlo v'achakach bishlo, if something was roasted and then it was cooked in water, diesh bishul achar tzli, there's a concept of cooking something in water after being roasted. Okay, let's turn the page, 79. V'rameir v'av Yossi, Amrina be'erevin, the Gemara in Erevin tells us, then we have a debate between Rav Meir and Rav Yossi, right? Because this was not agreed upon by all. The first opinion said, no. The first opinion said that cooking it after roasting, it's still, or cooking after roasting, it's still considered roasted. Halacha Rav Yossi, we learned elsewhere that the halacha is like Rav Yossi. The Ode and further, de Brisa Tana Lahai de Rav Yossi B'Lashon Rabim. The Brisa presented the view of Rav Yossi in the plural, which implies that more people go like that. Uchsheshem sheyesh bishul achar tzli va'afoy. And just like we could infer from the Gemara in Psachim that there is cooking in water after something was already roasted or baked, kach yesh tzli achar bishul. As so too, you could consider roasting something even after it was cooked. It would be considered roasted. The Svara Achasid is all the same logic. Okay, did I lose everyone? Okay, so let's review. And then we'll take questions. Okay.
Can you define terms?
Yes. Okay.
Cooking.
Okay. So I keep on saying cooking because by cooking I mean, and I'm gonna try to use the word boil because it's easier for us to hear. But the term cooking in this context, bishul typically means it translates cooking, but they mean in Talmudic terms, cooking means by definition in water. Okay. Tzli, roasting, or afoy, or baking, always means without water. Okay, afoy typically means like it's in a pan of some sorts, and tzli means just sitting over a fire. But it's the same thing. Tzli and afoy is roasting, and baking means anything that's done without a fire. So you're baking a cake, you're baking bread, you're baking a lasagna. That's all called tzli or afia. And then you have bishul, which means cooking by definition in halachic terms means with water. Okay, and what the Sefer Yereim is doing is saying like this. The Gemara in Psachim told us it connected a bunch of dots. There was a brisa that said when it comes to bread, on Pesach you have to have matzah. Matzah is a bread; it's a form of bread, has to be baked. Okay, so therefore and we had a debate. One opinion said that once it's baked, even if I cook it, it's still called baked. As long as I can still see a resemblance of bread, then it's still considered baked. Okay, that was the opinion of Rav Meir. Rav Yossi said no. Once something, even if it's baked, and then you go and you cook it, it loses its status of being bread. It's no longer considered bread because now I cooked it, and bread by definition is something that's baked. It's not called bread. I understand that in vernacular we'll say it's bread that's been boiled, but the point is that he's saying halachically it's no longer considered bread. Once I go what? Okay, good question. Right. So, bottom line is we say hamotzi on a bagel, and we'll see how far this applies. But the point is, he's saying it's oksar lechem, and the same principle is going to apply for the Karban Pesach, where you have to roast it. Rav Yossi is going to say, if I roasted it and then I boiled it in water, it loses its status of being roasted, and therefore I'm in violation of the prohibition of eating a Karban Pesach that was not roasted, because by boiling it in water, that undoes the original roasting. Okay, so the Sefer Yereim, Rav Metz wants to go ahead and take that principle and apply it to the laws of Shabbos. How so? Because in the laws of Shabbos, we saw that if I have something that was cooked already, so I have something, we talked about, I don't know, the hydrated noodle soup, right? Sorry?
Tradition.
Yeah, the Raymond tradition, right? Whatever company you use, yeah. So basically, those are pre-cooked, and then they dry them out, right? They cook the noodles, and then they dry them out, right? So a person could go ahead, according to many poskim, we said if you want to be machmir, put it in the third utensil, but according to many poskim, you could even put it in a klisheni. Why? Because they're pre-cooked, and now I'm cooking it a second time. Ein bishul achar bishul. There's no issue of cooking something in water, even after it's cooked in water once before. So
were they originally cooked in water or baked?
I believe they're cooked in water. I believe, and then they're dried out. I believe. Okay, so we saw. So let's just, I don't know. Someone help me out. Give me an example of something that's pre-cooked. Anything. I don't know. A piece of chicken. What?
Oatmeal.
Oatmeal gets into conclusions of Lisha.
Rice? They sell this pre-cooked rice.
Pre-cooked rice. Fantastic. So let's say you knew your rice was pre-cooked. Okay, anything that's pre-cooked. Couscous and pre-cooked couscous, pre-cooked rice, and you want to go and you want to heat it up in water again on Shabbos, you could put it in a klisheni, no problem, because it was cooked once before, you could put it directly into a klisheni, into a secondary utensil, that's fine, okay? So says the Sefer Yereim, that's true for items that were cooked, but let's say you had an item that was baked, let's say like challah, right? Your challah was baked, and now I want to put my challah into my klisheni, into my chicken soup, right? Which let's say is in a klisheni. Let's just make things simple. I had a pot of chicken soup, and then I poured it from my pot of chicken soup into my bowl, i.e. a klisheni, right? I'm going to skip the ladle. We'll come back to the ladle. Yeah, don't worry. But the point is that it's in my bowl. It's a klisheni. Can I put my challah into that? The answer is no, according to Sefer Yereim. Why? Because although the bread was baked, now it's something totally new. When I put it into boiling water, i.e. soup in this case, right? Soup in this case, I am not allowed to do so because it is, that would be considered bishul achar afiyah, which is prohibited.
But you could put matzo balls in because they were boiled.
So matzah balls already boiled, correct, and therefore it'd be okay. Assuming you made them by boiling them, which I think is the only way to make matzah balls. Fine, but if you want, right, correct, so you would be allowed, so good. But this is a good example where you have a scenario where you have the big pot of soup, and let's say you want to put the matzah balls in before, you take the big pot, you want to bring it to the table, and you want to put all the matzah balls in the soup. So yeah, let's say they were, and so on Shabbos, I don't know how you do things, but let's say you have your matzah balls are going to be in a separate dish because they weren't made in the chicken soup, right? They were made in a pot of water, right? So they're sitting on your fire Erev Shabbos, and and they're in a separate tin or whatever, and then you want to bring your big pot to the table. I know most of you are not going to bring your big pot to the table, but let's say you do, and you want to bring your pot to the table. So what you could take all your matzah balls, dump them into, okay, so here it's a kli rishon. Okay, so whatever, they're hot, so maybe technically you would be allowed to. Let's just say you put it in the bowl, just for argument's sake, you put them in a bowl, you empty out your big chicken soup into a big serving bowl, a beautiful serving bowl, and you can take all your matzah balls and put them in, no problem, okay? Sorry? A soup terrain, fantastic. Okay. Terrain, that's what it's called. Terrine. Oh, terrine. Oh yeah, like Turin or something. Okay, Eaton. Okay, fine. Thank you. Let's go. So okay, yes.
So it sounds like Chazal are saying you can't do a different kind of cooking after you did.
Mm-hmm.
It's like no matter which kind it is.
Correct. No mixing and matching. Right. Exactly. That's the principle. The principle is you can't mix and match. Okay. We're all good. In either direction. It's the same as he says at the end. As Sfara Echasi. It's the same principle. Even though the Gemara only talked about one direction, it's the same logic in the opposite direction. So just like you can't, that cooking after baking undoes the baking, and now it's called cooking. By cooking, I mean boiling in water. So too, if I boil something in water, then I bake it, it changes it. It changes it too substantially. Yes.
So if something's multi-processed, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
let's say in theory you heated up the matzo balls that were first cooked in water and
Yeah.
you heated up without liquid.
Yeah.
Does it assume the status of the last process?
So it would seem to be the case. There are some items where this is discussed, but it would seem, based on this principle, it would seem like the last one is the one that's considered the main one. Yeah, is that what you're... Okay, fine. Okay.
So I take a corned beef, I boil it
Yeah.
for a long time.
Yeah.
but then I put all kinds of stuff on it and I bake it for like 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Is that then considered baking, or, I mean, it's
Well,
been
what's the-
boiling for an hour.
Correct, right? So then you put it in the oven. Then you just throw it in the oven with. But even then, you're putting it in a liquid, right? Or are you putting it without it? You dry, no, put it without the liquid. Dry.
A little
Okay.
bit of liquid from it.
So it might be probably considered dry. I mean, again, halachically, what issue are you going to run into?
I'm saying, so is that, I can't do that on Shabbos. Well, I wouldn't do it on
You want to do it on Shabbos anyways. The only question is going to be where this gets complicated is, let's say, so now I have this cooked, which we're going to get to. So let's say I have my roast, which I cooked. How can you heat it up, right? Putting it on the hot plate, which again, we haven't touched hot plates yet, but we're going to get there. But I'm heating it up without liquid on Shabbos, right? I put it in my fridge, and I'm going to heat it up. So we're going to get into that. We'll see. It's allowed, but it's unique.
Cooked or baked.
Right, because we'll see when it comes to using our hot plate, we'll see soon, it's not going to make so much of a difference because the basic idea behind it is that it's not really called roasting at that point. It's called warming up, right? In other words, we all know, meaning no one's going to say that something you put on your hot plate was roasted or baked. It was warmed, heated, whatever you want to call it. But it's because as long as something's not sitting under a real fire, it's not going to really be processed at all. And therefore, we'll see the Chaznish, and we all rely on this. And therefore, however you initially, when you're talking about using a hot plate, meaning not putting it back in a fire, it's not going to be an issue. On Shabbos, the most practical place that is going to come up is really in a hot liquid. That's really where things are going to come up, I think. Yes?
So chulent.
Yeah.
Some people cook their chulent before, and then they put it in the crock pot. It's all cooked, and they put it in the crock pot. Some people, like me, put it in raw,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's cooking
Mhm.
during Shabbos,
Mhm.
and in the morning they take it out.
Yeah.
That's okay.
That's so here we're talking about redoing something, right? In other words, you're talking about I set a process. We'll talk about more about Shalom later, but the point is that there you set a process on, and we'll talk about the details of how to set up a Shalom properly. But that's going to be fine. Here we're talking about a scenario where I have again, my chicken soup, which is boiling hot, and I want to put bread into my chicken soup, right? Let's say I have a onion soup, right? So I want to have that fancy like onion soup with like the bread on the top and the cheese. Sorry. Croutons, thank you everyone. Okay, this is great. Okay, so I'm learning so much. Thank you. No, really, I'm not being sarcastic. What's it called? But okay, so what? It's not called. You put bread is also called croutons, really? Croutons are the yellow stuff, no? No. Okay, I'm so unsophisticated. Okay, the toasted bread, which now we're going to call croutons. Fine. You put the toasted bread on the top, and then you put a layer of cheese, right, and all that stuff. So can I? Right there, you want to serve that in the serving thing, right? So even, or I put it into the tureen, right? So I want to put in the tureen and then put the bread on top of it and the cheese on top of it. So there I would not be allowed to do so according to this, right? Because the bread was baked or toasted, right? And then I'm putting it into something which is cooking it. And that would be usher. It's called cooking. It's called cooking on Shabbos according to the Sefer Yerim. It might even be, might even be a Doraisa, right? If I do it in a Kli Rishon, I would not even be allowed to do it in a Kli Sheni because it would be a form of cooking, at least Midrabanan. I would not be allowed to even do this in a Kli Sheni, okay? So let's... Kli Shlishi, yes, yeah.
So you can take it from the pot in the tureen, put it in someone's bowl, and
then you certainly could do that. Exactly. Yes. Okay, so overall, it's only Kli Sheni, but once you're in a Kli Shlishi, everyone would agree that's okay. However, I'm going to make things complicated. We're going to see a Gemara in Brachos, right? Usually we've been, the goal of learning from this book was to get into the weeds of Gemara learning a little bit, right? So, or not. Okay, so the Gemara in Brachos seemingly contradicts this halacha that we learned in Maseches Pesachim. Why? So let's see. And what always happens in the Gemara is it's not going to be talking directly about our topic, but we're going to see certain principles that will be relevant to our topic. Okay, so hold on tight. So the Gemara Brachos says like this, source 4. Darash Rav Nachman Mishum Rabbeinu. Rav Nachman taught from Rabbeinu. Umanu, who is Rabbeinu in this context? Typically, Rabbeinu is Rav Yehuda HaNasi. Rav Yehuda HaNasi is the author of the Mishnayos. He's always called Rabbeinu, but in this context, Rav Nachman lived well after Rav Yehuda HaNasi. So Umanu Shmuel. Shmuel is the teacher that taught him the following. Shlakos, when it comes to boiled vegetables, mivarchim aleim borei pri adama. Okay, so far so good, right? That's what we all do. If you have some boiled carrots, peppers, whatever, right? You boil them in water, you'll still say borei pri adama. Okay. V'chavereinu hayordim Eretz Yisrael. However, our colleagues who came from Eretz Yisrael, umanu, who is that referring to? Ula, mishmeid Rav Yochanan. Okay, Amar shlakos mivarchim aleim shakol niyebed varo. A raw vegetable, they say have hadama on. But if you cook a vegetable, you boil it, according to them, you say shahakol. Don't worry, we don't rule like this. Let's keep on reading, okay? Vani Omer, and I say, Rav Nachman says, b'machlokes shenuya. This actually is not a debate amongst the Amoraim. Again, the Amoraim are those who lived from the year about 250 or so and on. Okay, but rather it goes back to the Tanaim. The Tanaim are those who are found in the Mishnah, in the Braisas. This is really an older debate. Titania, because we have a Braisa that says like this: Yotzin birkik hasharoi umavushal shaloni muach. Okay, because we have the Braisa. Remember this Braisa? Sounds familiar? That it says if you had a matzah which was baked and then you soaked it or you cooked it, then you could still fulfill your obligation. Divi Rabbi Meir. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rav Yossi Omer, Yotzim birkik hashari. If you soak it, it's considered still baked. Avalo b'mevushal, but once it's cooked in water, then it loses its original status. Afal pishlo nemoch, even though it wasn't dissolved. So Rav Nachman wants to come along and say this debate about what bracha to make on vegetables when they're boiled. One said you still say hadama. Okay, it's a vegetable. The other says no. Once it's boiled, then you no longer say hadama because it's no longer a vegetable. It's now something new. By cooking it, it's a new thing. He says this debate actually connects directly to the debate we saw about matzah. Because by matzah we said you have to have bread. And then one opinion said even after you cook the bread in water, it's still bread. Another says no, once you boil it, it loses its original status. It's something new. And therefore we want to say that these opinions kind of match up. The opinion who says that after you you boil the vegetables in water, you now say shahakol, it's because it's no longer a vegetable. It's something new. Okay, and that goes like Rav Yossi. Yes?
I can see how those are comparable, because the first case with the vegetables, it's a raw vegetable that you're cooking. And this other case is matzah, something that's already baked, so it's no longer the raw ingredients already. You've already removed it from that.
The similarity is the sense that both of them, the question is, does cooking undo is cooking called a transformation? Right? And so whether it's because it was baked initially, or because it's raw. The point is that it's cooking enough of a transformation that whatever it was before, whatever it was yesterday, is something entirely different. That's the commonality. Well,
yeah, but it doesn't seem, they really don't seem.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Okay, I hear you. Let's.
They didn't cook.
They cook plenty. There's one of the most beautiful Gemaras I find beautiful. The Gemara tells that Rava, I think it's Rava, and then we're going to have Sanhedrin, I think it's Beis Beis. He says that Rava, when he wanted to rule on the laws of animals, he started learning about laws of bechoros, different animals. He spent like a year living on a farm to know all these things. So I don't know. I'm not sure. Okay.
It's like most of their cooking was primarily in water, because they didn't have ovens where you could just stick things in.
It was either water or like directly over a fire, meaning they would stick things directly over a fire, what they would call roasting, or even baking, where they would stick things on.
Today, most of our stuff is in an oven.
Probably in an oven without liquid.
Maybe it might have changed a lot of their rulings.
It could be. Again, the principle is going to be consistent. Anything in water, halachically, is going to be considered bishul, cooking, boiling in water, and anything. And then there was always a discussion, like a little gravy, not a lot of gravy. We'll get into that a little bit more. But that's the general principle. Anything that's submerged in water is certainly going to be considered boiling according to halacha, whereas something that's not is going to be considered baking.
Today, when most of our stuff is done in an oven, they might change their definition of bishul.
You're saying the term, the term itself. Okay, I hear you. So let's go to the final. Yeah.
What about like juice?
I'm not going to go there because I want to confuse everyone. It's a good question. I don't want to talk about it because generally speaking, juice is shahakol. Depends on the type of juice, but it's.
Cooking in juice.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, that'll answer. Okay, cooking in juice. Yeah, that's boiling. If you cook it in juice, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah, if you.
Juice is considered water.
Correct. Any liquid. It doesn't have to be water. My apologies.
It's coming out of the meat itself.
It has to be submerged in it, so it's not usually the meat itself is not going to bring out enough that it's submerged. But if it's submerged in liquid, that's going to be considered boiling halachically. Okay. The Gemara concludes though. Velohi, the Gemara rejects Rav Nachman's comparison. Okay, not because of what Lisa said. But the Gemara says no. Everyone halachically agrees that you say hadama on boiled vegetables. V'ad kan lo kamar Rav Yossi hasam. Rav Yossi said his thing only there. Why? Keywords. El mishum de be'inan tam matzah v'leka. When Rav Yossi said that the reason that you need to have that when you boil the matzah, you cannot fulfill your obligation, it was not because of a general principle. It was a limited principle, right? It was limited because when it comes to matzah, it has to taste like matzah. And when you cook it, it no longer tastes like matzah, he says. Okay, aval hacha, but over here, afilu Rav Yossi modeh. Rav Yossi would agree. So what comes out of this Gemara in Brachos? The Gemara in Brachos, forget Hilchos Brachos for a second. Forget the laws of cooking, vegetables. Okay, we're not going to worry about that. But it sounds like Rav Yossi saying that it's very limited. His principle of saying that this idea of boiling something in water after baking, that it loses its original status, is only about matzah. It's only about matzah because by matzah it tastes like matzah. Would Rav Yossi say his law about Shabbos? That if I boil something after baking it, it's a problem? Who says? Who says? And therefore, let's turn the page. Okay, says the Ravya. The Ravya is one of the another Rishon, okay, medieval commentator. Source number 5. He says, "V'shamati mirabenu Eliezer mimitz." I heard from Rav Eliezer of Metz. Shaya Omer ein bishol achar bishol b'Shabbos, who said that although there is no boiling something after boiling on Shabbos, v'chein in afia achar afia b'Shabbos, and also there is no such thing as baking something after baking. Aval yesh afia achar bishol. But he concluded there is a problem of baking something after it was cooked. V'yesh bishol achar afia, and there is boiling something considered boiling after it's baked. Kigon lishros lechem beroseach. For example, to soak bread in boiling water would be in violation of laws of Shabbos. Uchiditznan, and his source is the Brisa yotzim berakik hasharim uvushol shlonimuach. That Rav Yossi Omer yotzim berakik hasharoi avalobim v'mushol afal pishloni muach v'lach Rav Yossi. Again, that was the Brisa that quoted Rav Yossi. V'la milsahi. He says this is nothing. It's not true. He says this is incorrect. Because we quote this Gemara of Rav Yossi in Meseches Brachos, we just saw, umaskina, and we conclude over there, ad kan lo kam Rav Yossi, elagabe matzah. When did Rav Yossi say his halacha? Only regarding matzah. Because you need to have a taste of matzah, and you don't have a taste of matzah when it's boiled in water afterwards. In other words, he is quoting the Gemara in Brachos and saying, how could you then extend the law to the laws of Shabbos? In Brachos, it limited it only to matzah, and it's not a general principle. Yeah? You with me? Ish? Yes. Yeah, we said we're going to hold off on bagels. Okay, so we're gonna hold up. So I'm gonna just veer away because I want to get into the into what's it called, into laws of brachos, because it's gonna confuse us. But because there are sometimes slightly different principles by brachos. But the bottom line is you have like this. Let me just quickly review. You have one Gemara. We have a statement of Rav Yossi who talks about matzah on Pesach, and he says if I have matzah, I take my matzah out of my box and I boil it in water. Okay, so Rav Yossi says I do not fulfill my obligation. And no one's debating that Rav Yossi is correct, that we listen to Rav Yossi, we rule like Rav Yossi. If I put matzah in boiling water, I do not fulfill my obligation. The basic debate is, all Gemara's aside is he saying a general principle that when I cook something after I bake it, it loses its original status? And therefore, when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, if I were to go ahead and boil in water something I baked, that would be considered full-fledged boiling. Even though if I were to boil something that I already boiled before, that's not problematic. But if I were to go ahead and boil something which I baked, we'd say just like Rav Yossi said about matzah, he's going to say it here too. Or, and that's the opinion of Rav Eliezer Mimetz, or do we say like the Ravya, that no, he was talking about matzah and matzah only, and when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, it wouldn't be the case. And therefore, once something is baked, i.e. it was processed with fire, I could go ahead and throw all that bread into I can make my French onion soup by putting the bread directly into the pot, because, certainly into a klisheni, that would not be an issue. That's the debate, okay? With me? Fine. Yeah? So let's see how the poskim rule on this. Says the Shulchan Aruch, source 6 on page 80. Yesh Misha Omer. Let's read these words very careful, because we're going to come back to these words. Yesh Misha Omer. There is Yesh Misha Omer. There is one who says Dedavar shenefa onitzla, something which was baked or roasted in bishlo acher kach b'mashka. If a person then goes and cooks it in water, Yesh mishum bishul. There is a prohibition. You violated the prohibition of cooking. Va'asr litin pas. And therefore it's forbidden to put bread, afilu b'chli sheni, sheyad seledisbo, you're not allowed to put bread even into a secondary utensil as long as the water is hot. V'yesh matirin, and there are those who permit it. So the Shulchan Aruch basically is incorporating both those views. He quotes the first view and the second view. Okay, he says that it's forbidden, and then he says there are those who allow it. Let's turn the page 81. The Ramah, which is how us Ashkenazim rule. V'nagu lizar lechatchila shlolitin pas afilu b'chli sheni kozman sheyed seledes bo. The Ramah rules stringently, saying that you are not, he like the second opinion, and he says you should not put bread even into a secondary utensil as long as the water is very hot. So again, if you went ahead and poured your soup into another, what's the term again? Sorry? Tureen, thank you. I'll get it straight eventually. I put it in tureen, into a tureen on Shabbos. You are not allowed to then go ahead and put bread into it. That would be considered bishul, be considered cooking according to Ashkenazi ruling. The Sfardim, he lists both opinions. Okay, so let's go a little further, and we're going to get to practical examples soon. More practical examples in source 7. The Shulchan Aruch writes as follows. This is a different place in Shulchan Aruch. He says, "Davar shenisbashal kol tzorka v'hu yavesh she'ein bo marak." Let's say he says there's something which is fully cooked. Okay, and then and it's dry. Okay, something which is completely dry. There's no liquid there. Mutter lahanicho keneged hamadura afil b'makom sheyad tzeledesbo. You're allowed to place it near a fire, even in a scenario where it is where it's going to get very hot. So he says that let's say you have a boiling fire, you have a fire on Shabbos, and you have an item which you cooked. I'm allowed to place it near that fire, even though that fire is now going to be quote unquote roasting it. This seems to be in contradiction to what he said earlier. He said there's two views. Here he seems to be saying it's okay, since once it was cooked, I'm allowed to go ahead and roast it. That seems to contradict what he said before, where he listed.
Go ahead and roast it.
He says in this case in source number 7, he says something which was cooked. So I have a
Something's
boiled.
That's why.
Because it's not a kugel. I was thinking kugel, but it's not.
Okay, sorry. Again, because Talmudic terminology, I apologize. Okay, I'm going to keep on trying. Thank you. Keep on correcting me, okay? So something which was boiled. So I had a piece of chicken which I boiled in the chicken soup, okay? So I made my chicken soup. I have boiled chicken, okay? I made it by putting in the chicken soup, and I took out the chicken, and this is my boiled chicken, okay? And now I dried it off from all the liquid, and it sat there, dried it out. And then on Shabbos, I go and I place it next to a fire, okay? And it's going to get very hot, right? It's sitting next to a fire. No problem, says the Shulchan Aruch. No problem. Why? Since it was cooked and boiled in water before, right? Or boiled in chicken soup before, and now when I'm baking it, now when I'm roasting it, it's fine. It's basically, once it was gone through the heating process, there's no secondary process, right?
But you say there's no roasting after. There's no fia after. There is.
There is. That's the problem, because the Shulchan Aruch, this is a contradiction. In source number 6, he said there's two opinions, and here he seems to be saying it's okay. In source 6, he listed two opinions. Here he says it's okay. So what's going on? Okay, and ask the Be'er Halacha. Right? Exactly, the Be'er Halacha asked your question. In source number 8, Tzarech Iyun. We have to. This requires analysis. Hala'el b'sifhei. A few lines earlier, he maybe Dasa Rebbe Eliezer Mematz. He brings the opinion of Eliezer Mematz, who says that we should be stringent. He brings two opinions. Okay, yet over here he seems to have Eich Matir Hacha B'Stam. Over here he seems to be totally lenient without bringing the stringent opinion. Right? So let's see source number 9, and let's see. There's different ways of answering this question. So source number 9. Says the Chazon Ish, Val Korchach Tzarech Lomar Dekol Shelo Yavo L'Tam Tzli Mamish. Any scenario where it's not going to become to a scenario where it's going to taste like a roasted item, it's just going to get dried out. There's no issue of cooking after cooking. And it's possible that roasting in a pot, meaning placing something in a pot without liquid, that's fine. Only when I'm roasting something directly over coals or in a spit over fire, that's called roasting. Right? So the Chazon Ish says that maybe in the scenario that the Shulchan Aruch was talking about, where I had a piece of chicken, which I boiled in my chicken soup. So it's considered boiled. And then I put it near a fire. Unless I'm putting it like directly over the fire, or I'm putting it over coals where it really gets like barbecued, it really gets roasted. Otherwise, it's just going to heat it up and even dried out because it's so hot. As long as in any scenario it's not going to really be over the fire, that's not really called sli, and therefore would just be called warming it up and would be allowed. That's one way of answering this question, of saying yes, the Shulchan Aruch really, meaning one way of addressing this, saying really the Shulchan Aruch lists both views, and says on the one hand there are those who are lenient about baking after boiling and boiling after baking, but there's opinion who's stringent, and therefore presumably you should be stringent, right? But in this case, I'm just warming something up, I'm putting it next to the fire, and therefore it's allowed. Yes?
So is that why we can use a warming tray?
This would be one of the reasons you're allowed to use a warming tray. Exactly. However, Rav Avad Yosef gives a different answer. Okay, source number 10. I'm sorry, today is a very involved, into halachic analysis. We'll walk away with some practical applications at the end, I promise. I shouldn't say I promise, but I hope. But let's keep on reading. There's some fascinating fascinating analysis of here. Says the Levi Yischen, this is from the Rav Avad Yosef. He says like this: Lo kasha midi. He says, no question. Ulefi hachlal shebiyadenu, based on the principle that we have. The principle is brought in this book called the Knesset Gdola. Wherever the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo, brings two opinions, Yesh Omrim v'Yesh Omrim, where he brings two opinions, says there are those who say this, and those who say this, Halacha ki Yesh Omrim Basra. The law is like the second one. Let's go back. What does the Shulchan Aruch say? He says there are those who are stringent, and then he said there are those who are lenient. What's he telling us? What's he doing? Okay, which one is he telling us to rule like? Practically, the Shulchan Aruch is supposed to be a practical book. So Rav Avadia says we always go like the second opinion. There are those who say this and those who say that. You always go with the second opinion. And therefore, there's no contradiction. Because although in Sif Hey he lists both the strict opinion, the opinion that says that there is an issue of boiling after baking or baking after boiling, he then says there are those who don't say it's an issue. So therefore, that's clearly how he rules. And therefore, there's no contradiction at all. In Sif Hey, he was telling us both opinions, but he was ruling like the more lenient opinion. And in Sif Tes Vav, he was just going like the more lenient opinion. Okay? Therefore, in Sif A, Dasmar Lahakil Livso Kedatsa Rav Yava Mordechai, really he's ruling like the more lenient opinions, the Rav Yava, the Mordechai, She'ein Bishul Achar Fia V'Tzliya, and there is no boiling after baking. Vimkain Gam Kan Nimshach Lishitaso. This is consistent. Okay, let's just jump to source 11. This is how Ravad Yosef rules. Source 11. So if you're Sephardic, listen closely. He says, "V'chein mutar litain pas b'mrak cham sheyad soledesbo." You are allowed, according to Sephardim, you are allowed to go ahead and throw bread, baked bread, right? Bread into a kli rishon, v'afilu b'kli rishon she'eino al eish, and also a kli rishon off the fire. So if you have French onion chicken soup and you're Sephardic and you want to make it into, and you want to put croutons on the top of it, you're allowed to throw them into the kli rishon that was taken off the fire. V'chei muter l'tavot tzanim and yeveshim v'marak kadesh yisrachu v'yuchal lechlam. You're allowed to put dry toast into soup to soften it, to make it edible. Okay, muter litin shkadei marak. You're allowed to place croutons into boiling soup. L'soch marak roteach, boiling soup. Af l'soch kli rishon. She'eino al eish, which is on the fire. Shim she'en bishul achar bishul ki biyavesh. Just like there's no boiling after boiling, kach in bishul achar tigon. There's no cooking, boiling after something is fried. Okay, that's Sephardic psak. You are allowed to go ahead and place baked items into a kli rishon as long as it's not on the fire. So again, you take your chicken soup off the fire and you're allowed to then go ahead and put bread in it. Not a problem. Yes.
So according to Rabbi Yosef, he says, you always can say like the second opinion of Torah. Is that his shita or is that like an accepted shita? Is that well known? He just brought it in here. It seems like
I can't say definitively. I'm not 100% sure. There is some debate. I know there's some debate around this, but he's not. I mean, he's quoting the Knesset Gdola, which is one of the earlier, really like early Achron. This is consistent with Ravadia's ruling, correct? This is consistent within Ravadia's world. I'm not 100% sure if everyone agrees to his opinion about the second opinion. I'm not sure 100%. I'm not sure 100%. Yes.
So if you're Ashkenazi and you go to your Sephardi friends for Shabbos and
okay, so presumably there's what? So let's see. So we're going to get into discussions about if someone does something which is usher. This is going to come up in a whole bunch of cases, right? We're going to talk about, let's hold off on the discussion now, but this comes up all the time. For example, let's say a person doesn't open cans on Shabbos, okay? And someone does, okay? It's a legitimate halachic debate, right? So are you allowed to, let's say someone goes ahead and opens a can on Shabbos, and then, does it for you, says, oh, I know you don't open cans here, I'm going to open this can of soda and gives it to you, right? Are you allowed to then go ahead and drink the can of soda? Or was the malacha just done for you? Okay, so we're going to hold off. It's a fast, right? It comes up a lot. It comes up a lot in different discussions. Yes?
I mean, I feel like in this case, it says specifically that there is two tzadim and we're being machmir. It doesn't say it's usher. Even the Ramah says we're being machmir. Just be careful. So I feel like
Well, you're right. So that's fair. That's fair. The Ramah does say v'nagu lizar lechatchila. That's true. The terminology of the Ramah over here, you're right. It says that ideally we should go with this opinion, which would certainly seem like if it was done even by an Ashkenazi by mistake. Let's say you forgot and you got all confused. This class, the most confusing class you ever went to, and you're like, oh, I could put bread into soup because that's what he said. So then you did it by mistake. Then that's a very fair point. The Ramah's terminology here is not that we should this, but he says v'nagu lizar lechatchila. He doesn't say we should go with the more stringent opinion. He says ideally we should do this. Clearly, b'diavad, if it happens, it would be okay. So in this case, it's okay. We'll come back to cans at a later point. Okay. Says the Orcha Shabbos. Orcha Shabbos is a modern Ashkenazi book. It's like this. At source 13 on page 83. Kasra Poskin. Shein levashel davar afoy otzli. You should not cook, meaning boil in water, something which is baked or roasted. Even though technically, the Torah, when the Mishnah, when it talks about the prohibition of Shabbos, says bishul. Bishul means cooking in water, but we include baking in there, and therefore you could think they're one and the same. He says no. Mikol makom pu'ulas bishul nosenes tam chadash b'ma'achal. Boiling something in water gives a different taste. V'choshim le'isur bishul achar and we're concerned that there's a prohibition of therefore boiling something in water after baking. Ulechein, and therefore ein litin pas b'marak cham shayad. So let us know you should not place bread into hot soup. Okay, vafilo marak b'kli sheni asr, even if the soup is in a secondary utensil. Similarly, in liten biskiot b'sochos teh, you should not place biscuits. Biscuits are baked items into a cup of tea. Afshi kli sheni, tea which is in a kli sheni. How do you have clean a kli sheni? Tea in a kli sheni. How does that happen? Well, you have to use the only way to have tea in a klisheni, I think, would be only through tea essence, right? Because otherwise you would not be able to make the tea. So he's talking about if you made tea in a klisheni, right? Which would mean I use tea essence, then I should not go ahead and dip my biscuits into it, my cookies into it, or you have, let's say, hot cocoa, in a, like really hot cocoa, in a klisheni, let's say. In such a case, you would not be allowed to go ahead and dip your cookies into it, because it would be, the cookie is baked, and you're putting it into something which would then go ahead and cook it. So if it's in a klishlishi,
You can make cocoa in a klisheni?
it depends on what type of cocoa it is. Let's say certainly syrup. You can make okay, but depends. You'd have to. It depends on the type of cocoa it's going to be. Yeah. Yes. Let us b'v'chein in litin chavitit blintzas b'soch marak avshu b'chlishen. Okay, you put some blintzas in soup, whatever. Fine. Chavches in litin tavliot avakat sukrazit, right? That's the sugar stuff that they have in Israel. So you shouldn't place sweetener tablets or powder, even in a klisheni. Oftentimes, the substance is baked; it's not cooked. Then it's cooking in water after something's baked. Similar to other type of instant types of things, soluble types of things, cacao, avakat marak, shein litno mechlisheni, elam ken yodeh bavir, shekol chomer ravim bavakot, elu avram gam talik shal bishol velo shal afia. So you have to know, if the process, let's say you have cocoa, or you have coffee, if it went through a cooking process, if it was pre-cooked, then you're allowed to put it into a kli sheni. If not, you should put all these things into a kli shlishi. Yes?
When
Yeah.
those are fried, they're cooked.
So fried, we're saying is so fried. Cooked, so cooked is going to be like immersed, boiled in water. It has to be like immersed in water. A blinta which has like a little bit of oil on the bottom, that's different than boiling it in water. So basically, we're going to say that a blinta, right? That's why he gives an example of that. Something which is there's like roasted fire alone, there's like fried oil, and there's baking. None of those should be matched.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go a little bit further. Just trying to let's just skip to source 16 in the Shulchan Aruch. Source 16 in Shabbos Kol Chaso on page 84. Lefikach says Shabbos Kol Chaso, Asr litin lechem b'soch hamarak. A person should not put bread into soup. Again, we saw this earlier, not to put biscuits or matzah into tea. As long as it's in a kli rishon. Similarly, you can't go ahead and put bread on the bottom of your kli sheni and pour hot water onto it, because we said iroi kli rishon is like a kli rishon. We also saw that you shouldn't put things which would be considered cooking into a kli sheni. When it comes to the spoon or the ladle, that does not have the status of a kli rishon. This is the ladle that we've been pushing off discussing. Therefore, you could be lenient and place bread in soup as long as I went ahead. Let's say I have my soup, that's a kli rishon, and then I took my ladle and I put it in my ladle in. Okay, so my ladle, he says, in this regard, is going to be considered a kli sheni, and then I put it into my soup. Now my soup is a kli shlishi. I can put my bread into it. But he limits it. It's worth noting that he says this is a rule that's going to be limited to this halacha of bishul achar afia achar bishul. He's not going to take. He says a ladle in general is a little complicated because a ladle is not really a secondary utensil. It's kind of going into the first utensil. In this regard, we're going to treat it like a kli sheni. Okay, but he says, let's say I'm talking about something which was not cooked at all. Right? Let's say I'm talking about a lemon, okay? I want a lemon, and I have a pot of hot water. Bear with me. And I put a ladle into a pot of hot water, and then I pour it into another kli. He says, in that regard, I'm not going to treat it like a kli. I'm not going to treat the ladle like a kli sheni, and therefore say I could put the lemon in the kli shlishi, because it's only over here, which already the bishul achar tzli and tzli achar bishul is a stringency to begin with. There I'm going to treat the ladle more leniently and treat it like a kli sheni. You with me? In other words, he's combining kulas over here. Let's take a step back. your ladle. How do you look at a ladle? Is a ladle a klisheni? Okay, I'm killing you guys. I know. I'm sorry. Okay. I know this is one of the more confusing classes. I'm going to take a step back. We kli rishon, kli sheni, kli shlishi, right? A ladle, right? A ladle I'm putting into my kli rishon. Do I therefore treat it as a kli sheni? Or do I say, no, it's just a part of the Kli Rishon. I'm just taking something out of the Kli Rishon. It's not the same as pouring it out. It hits the air, it then goes out, and then falls in something else. Maybe a ladle is something different, right? And he says, yeah, maybe it is. Maybe it is. So we're not sure about a ladle. Sometimes, right, and then we saw earlier, and we spoke about this as well, that in a scenario where the ladle is in the soup pot for a long time, then it's certainly we're going to treat it like a Kli Rishon. When it's not in the soup pot all the time, uncertain. So he says like this. Normally, in a scenario where, let's say again, it was hot water, and I took my ladle, I just took a ladle, and I took it out of the hot water out, okay, and I poured it into another kli, and then I want to go ahead and put something raw in, don't do it. Because maybe the ladle is still a kli rishon, and then it went from a kli rishon to kli sheni, I don't put raw items into a kli sheni. But in this scenario, where I want to put bread in, right? Bread being cooked after baked is a stringency that Ashkenazim hold of. But we're not going to layer all the stringencies. And therefore, in this particular regard, if I'm using a ladle and I pour it into a kli, I pour it from the soup pot into my bowl, in this regard, I'm going to treat it like my ladle like a kli sheni, and therefore my soup bowl like a kli shlishi, and therefore I'm going to be allowed to put my bread into the soup. Got it? So again, generally we're not going to treat a ladle like a kli sheni, but in regards to this stringency of baking after cooking after baking, here we're going to be lenient because we're not going to layer on all the chumras together. Yes?
So with a kli sheni, you actually usually have to be pouring from the kli rishon into the kli.
Sorry, start again. Sorry. One more time.
So generally, not with this bread, but
Yeah.
you have to be pouring the liquid from the first vessel, from the kli rishon, into another vessel, and that's the kli sheni. So in other words, you can't have a pot of boiling water, or now it's off the fire, and take another pot and dip it in and use it like a ladle and say, now that's your kli sheni.
Correct. Generally speaking,
It has to be poured.
it has to be poured. Generally speaking, we're going to want to pour it out. Correct. To be considered a kli sheni. Exactly. Yes.
Now, this hula about using the ladle and then being able to put bread into your soup bowl, does that apply even if the ladle's been sitting hot?
Right. So I think I said, right? So again, maybe I wasn't clear. But
We never do, even if the ladle's been there for a while.
if the ladle's been there for a while and the ladle's really hot, there we're going to say we're not, even in this, regarding this stringency, right, we're still going to treat it as then we will treat it like a kli rishon, because then it's like, it really is a kli rishon. It's sitting in the pot with everything else, then we're going to treat it as a kli rishon. It's only the ladle that you use and you're holding it back and forth, that will treat as a kli sheni. Okay, so one last halacha, and that is about coffee. So again, we saw, what did we see about coffee? We said that when it comes to, so it depends how coffee, generally speaking, let's just say like this. Generally speaking, you want to make coffee in a kli shlishi. It would be probably ideal to make coffee in a kli shlishi, just to be safe. Depends on the processing of the coffee. You'd want to go ahead and make it, so if you have instant coffee, you'd want to go ahead and make it in a kli shlishi, just to be safe. Depends on the process. Maybe it was baked and roasted, right? If it's roasted, then you would not be allowed to go ahead and put it into your kli sheni, because it's bishul achar afia, right? So therefore, you do it in a kli shlishi, and you're okay, right? So with coffee, again, you have instant coffee. The best way to make coffee to be safe is to go ahead, you put it into a kli sheni, and then you put it into kli shlishi, and then you can put your instant coffee into that. Yes.
That's why you can add the sugar also in the kli. Let's say if you're adding sugar.
So sugar, how's sugar processed? Is it
No,
plain sugar? So does it go through any heat of any sort?
Yeah, I was gonna ask what.
I'm not sure what the process is. I'm not sure the process. I drink black coffee. Kli shlishi certainly would be okay as well. I mean, there's no question kli shlishi. I don't know if it goes through any processing, which may allow kli sheni, but certainly again, kli shlishi, you'd be good to go. Generally speaking, on Shabbos, for most things, if you always forget anything, just put in a kli shlishi and you're good to go. Like that's you want your bottom line from this whole discussion the past 3 weeks. Put things in a kli shlishi, you're good to go. The one discussion is we saw kale bishul, right? We saw these things which cook easily. So there is, right? We saw there are those who are strict about tea. What about coffee that was not pre-brewed or roasted, right? There is some discussion. They bring a whole bunch of opinions. I'm going to suggest you skip. Yeah.
Something that's dehydrated. What's the status of
It's usually not just dehydrated. Usually it's like cooked or baked and then it's dehydrated. So the dehydration doesn't change it. But it's not baking. It depends, unless it's depends on the processing of there's freeze dried, which I think is
That's
then
what
it's
I meant.
yeah. If it's freeze dried, your typical instant coffee is freeze dried. So therefore, but it's Yeah. So if it's
I know that
roasted.
there's a thing with Starbucks Via.
So Starbucks Via, yeah. So this is, so he brings up Starbucks Via. So good. She brings up Starbucks Via over here in source 21. It's a little bit misleading. So because he ultimately concludes you can't make Starbucks Via. What's Starbucks Via? Starbucks Via is coffee that was not pre-brewed. Okay, meaning your typical instant coffee, Taster's Choice, Folgers, whatever you're drinking, that is coffee that was made, and then they go ahead and they roast, they basically freeze it, they break it down to little particles, and that's how you make your coffee. Starbucks Via, as they write over here, apparently it took 20 years to develop this. Okay, so basically what happens is that it's basically it's beans which are roasted. It was not pre-cooked. It wasn't made into coffee. Meaning our instant coffee was made into coffee, and then they dry it out, and then you're drinking it again. But it's like, if you're a coffee snob, then that's like, I wouldn't drink a coffee that was already made once before. I have to drink fresh coffee. So Via, Starbucks Via is basically, it's like fresh coffee. Okay? So here you get into debates. If you don't make tea on Shabbos, so I don't know why they bring down this opinion over here, because this is going with the stringent view, which says that if you don't make tea on Shabbos, then you shouldn't make this either. Because coffee is very similar to tea in the sense that it could be seen just like tea, right? Why did the poskim say? Why did the Aruch HaShulchan and others say that it's kali bishul? Why they say it's one of the exceptions that you can never cook it even in a kli shlishi? Is because you put the tea bag in and immediately changes colors. You're seeing it's cooking, right? So if you don't make tea on Shabbos, putting these Starbucks Via into your hot water, it's also kali bishul, and you should be allowed to do it. But for those of you who make tea, it's no different, and be allowed to put it into a kli shlishi on Shabbos. Right? So if you don't make tea on Shabbos, don't drink Starbucks Via. If you do drink tea on Shabbos, you're allowed to drink Starbucks Via, just in Kli Shlishi. So again, bottom line is, Kli Shlishi, you're virtually always good.
I think the Rav Soloveitchik held that coffee's not a spice, so it's got a whole different set of halachas anyway.
How you use it.
I'm not sure what, yeah. Okay, right. So I'm not sure why. I mean, spices we're generally a little bit more lenient about. Bottom line is, you can make Starbucks. If you drink tea on Shabbos, then you could drink Starbucks Via on Shabbos. That's fine. I've just mentioned because it's come up a couple of times. Let's say you don't have Starbucks. Let's say you're not Starbucks Via, but you have coffee that you have a pour over coffee, right? That you want to make on Shabbos, right? So just very briefly, the question of borer always comes up. Are you separating, right? There's a notion of you can't separate the good from the bad. There is a case in the Gemara. So how does a pour over coffee work? You have a filter. You put the coffee grinds over here, and then you pour hot water over it, right? You can't use a machine on Shabbos to do that, but let's say I'm pouring water, and so what I would be allowed to do is, again, it has to be Kli Shlishi. I cannot, right? I cannot go ahead. I'd have to go ahead, or even Erev Kli Sheni is the same thing. So I take my water, and then I'd go ahead and, for Kli Shlishi, I'd want to pour it into another cup. I take it from the urn, pour it into another cup, and then I could pour it over. Why am I allowed to pour it over? Why is it not borer? The Gemara, the Mishnah in Shabbos tells us that let's say a person has wine, and they have dregs of wine, and they want to get and they have water, and they want to get the wine out so they can have a cup of wine. Okay, back in the day, right? So basically, I have dregs of wine. It's from the bottom of the barrel. Sorry. Sediment, thank you. Okay, sediment, thank you. You have sediment of wine, and you want to get the liquid out of the sediment, so you take water and you pour over it. Is that borer? Are you separating with the machine? The answer is that since it was water before and it's water after, halachically, it's not considered borer. Okay, it's a longer discussion, but that's example given in the Mishnah. There's no prohibition. So a pour over coffee would be the exact same thing. You're pouring water, it's water before, it's water after. So again, as long as it's a kli shlishi, because there, we're definitely talking about things which are raw. Kli shlishi, again, if you don't make tea on Shabbos, don't do that. But if you do make tea on Shabbos, you'd be allowed to do a pour over. You'd be allowed to make a pour over coffee on Shabbos. That would be okay. So again, bottom line is you want to walk. French press is already different because then you're already pushing it. I would stay away from a French press. That I would not do. But a pour over where you're not moving it via dayim, that would be okay according to many poskim. Okay, so again, kli shlishi is your one rule that you want to know. Hopefully, walked away with some principles. Sfardim are much more lenient than us. If you want to put your challah into your soup, you want to be careful. This is an important thing to keep in mind. Don't leave your ladle in a boiling in a hot pot of soup, because in doing so, then you actually could run into a real problem of again, it's not only a problem with Ashkenazim, it's only a problem. But you should really be careful not to leave your ladle in the chicken soup, because if you're going for doubles and it's still hot, then you would not be allowed to put challah or croutons into it. But assuming you take your ladle out after you cooked it, and then you go and you serve your soup, you'd be allowed to put bread into your soup, because at that point already it would be a kli shlishi according to most opinions. Yes.
Those little mini magnums, they seem like they're cooked. I mean, they're fried.
They're fried, so fried is different than
Are they,
cooking.
like, deep fried?
I don't know. They're probably are deep fried, but I'm not sure. Just to be safe, But people want to throw matzah. It's just a good idea. If people want to throw challah into thing, be safe. Be responsible way of serving soup on Shabbos for Ashkenazim would be to just make sure you don't leave the ladle too long in the
But
pot.
if you say, I just ran into this on Yom Tov. If you take your ladle out, but you're serving 16 people, by the time you're at 16, your ladle's still pretty hot. 'Cause it's
Okay, so I hear. You have to know if how boiling hot it is. I'm not sure. It's a good question. I don't know. It's a good thing it was Yom Tov. There's no visual.